Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thank you for bearing with us with a slightly later start. I'm Robert Bohr from Privacy Kitchen. I'm the CEO and founder of Keepable, the GDPR SaaS service, giving you a great answer for the board and customers, making GDPR really easy. This webinar is part of Privacy Kitchen, free video help on GDPR and all things privacy. And I'm absolutely delighted that Jamal has joined us. Jamal Ahmed is the founder of Kazient Privacy Experts, and you'll have seen him on BBC News and Sky News and all over the TV. He's an absolutely authoritative voice on privacy and also security, which obviously this is a really interesting case of, the Blackbaud brief. So, morning, Jamal. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Robert, and thank you very much for having me on your show.
It's an absolute pleasure. This is our first coffee break, and so I'm delighted it's with your good self. And coffee breaks are all about inviting guest chefs on who can share their fantastic expertise and experience, giving us all tips we can use in our daily job. So we started a few minutes late, so I'll crack on. I imagine, like me, many people won't have heard of Blackbaud before this. So could you just give us a quick overview of who actually they are?
Yeah, so Blackbaud is actually a US-based organization, and they're absolutely massive. They're one of the biggest cloud suppliers. In fact, they are the biggest cloud software as a service supplier for non-profits and the educational sector. So universities, schools, colleges, charities, national trusts, they all use Blackbaud software as a service to enable them to do everything from data analytics all the way to managing fundraisers and looking after the fundraising strategies.
Right. So it's a very unique but very large population of customers there, and something that often we don't hear about in the press in this way. And just before we go into it in more detail, what actually is ransomware? What was this attack about? What's ransomware?
So ransomware is a type of software that's malicious. Now, malicious software is software that's downloaded onto your devices, into your systems with one purpose: to cause disruption, to cause mayhem, to cause you pain. And what malware does, they will encrypt files, they will lock you out of computers so that you can no longer access them, or they'll start sharing them, or they'll start deleting them. The whole point is to cause chaos, so the person or the organization that's responsible for those files and for that data can no longer access it, or they start losing it. And the idea is that someone will then ask you for a ransom, and that's where ransomware comes in. So ransomware is a type of malicious software where the malware comes in and starts taking over your files, starts locking you out of them, or starting to share and delete those. And the only way to usually stop that is to either pay them and hope they will stop, but we all know there is no honor among thieves, so there's absolutely no reason why you should pay them. And all of the official guidance across law enforcement agencies across the world is do not pay for ransomware. It's a bit like pirate attacks that we see out in the seas. If you pay the pirates, they will continue to come and ransack and raid your goods and your ships. It's the same with ransomware. These are cyber pirates, for want of a better expression, that are going to start attacking you. And once one of these pirates knows that you're going to start paying them to stop that ransomware, their word's going to spread, and they're going to tell all their pirate friends to come and start attacking you because you're someone that pays. So please, I would urge everyone, follow the official guidance from all law enforcement agencies across the world, and do not pay into the hands of these petty criminals, and do not pay for ransoms when they infect you with ransomware.
Absolutely. Once they know you pay, then they're coming back. Absolutely. So they were attacked by ransomware, but it didn't manage to take hold. Can you tell us a bit more exactly what happened in this breach and what Blackbaud were able to do?
So it's not very clear exactly the steps Blackbaud took, and I think it's very wise that they don't reveal everything they did, because then the criminals watching will think like, okay, that's what you've done, so now we know what we need to do to come and attack you. But what they say happened is they discovered that some of the files, some of the systems started being taken over by this ransomware, and they was contacted by the criminals asking them to make a payment so that they don't share this, and they will delete the information. Now, what Blackbaud say they have done is they used law enforcement agencies. I think they got the FBI involved, and they also used their own internal resources to be able to fight off that attack and restrict the damage that was done. And one of the things they decided to do, unfortunately, on this occasion was to actually pay the criminals the ransom demand so that in return they delete that data. Now, of course, as we know, the criminals took that money and said they have deleted the data, but whether that has been deleted or whether that will materialize on the dark internet only remains a matter of time for us to find out.
Yeah, and what sort of data are we talking about here with the universities, schools, and what have you? And the Labour Party, as we saw, is another one, and the National Trust even. So what sort of level of data do we know is being compromised?
Yeah, so I mean, in the UK, we've had over 150 organizations that have been named, and a large number of them, as you mentioned, are universities and educational institutions, and also a large number of charities as well. You mentioned even the Labour Party was a victim of this act. Now, it's very difficult to say what kind of data, because each of these organizations may have different processes and they may collect different types of personal data. However, what we do know is that Blackbaud have made a statement categorically saying that no financial information, no credit card details was involved as part of the breach. Now, the question is, if that's the case, then why have all of these data controllers, these organizations, started writing out to their customers that have been affected?
Yeah.
So we know under GDPR and under the Data Protection Act 2018, data controllers only have an obligation or a duty to write out to individual whose data is concerned if they deem the risks to be high, or if they think there's a high risk of harm. And therefore, the fact that so many of these organizations are actively writing out to individuals, to me, suggests that there is likely to be a high risk of harm here.
Yeah, I think that risk is a really interesting one. Can you tell us a bit more about, we'll come to the risk assessment itself in one sec, but could you just recap for us who's the controller, who's the processor in this situation, and what the obligations on each of those parties are when there's a breach?
Yeah, so under the general data protection regulations, we have an organization that can fit into two different categories when they're processing and collecting personal data. So the data controller, the definition of the data controller is the organization that decides the means and the purposes for the processing. So for example, if I was to go out and collect data so I can market some of my books, for example, then I would be the data controller of the personal data that I'm collecting. So for example, I might ask for people's names and email addresses so that I can contact them and tell them about this fantastic book that I've written. Now, I might not have the time in my hands to be able to do that. So I might ask an organization that does marketing or that does that to say, hey, can you go and find a list of people that are interested in GDPR and how to become compliant and get those details from me so I can contact them and ask them if they want to buy my book. Now that agency there is also a data processor. The only reason they're going out and collecting that data and processing it is because I've asked them to do that and I've told them exactly what I want. And then it's up to them to go and do that. But if it had not been for my instructions, they would not be doing that. So it's deemed that I am the person that's deciding the means and the purposes of that processing, and therefore I am the data controller. So in the situation that we're talking about here, Blackbaud, for most of the processing that they do it on behalf of organizations. They work with organizations in over 100 countries in the world, and they are the fourth biggest cloud software as a service provider in the world. So they are a massive data processor.
Yeah, and then
however,
as you mentioned, there's all the different countries, and obviously each country has its own data protection laws, and obviously the GDPR applies throughout the EEA at the moment, and in this transitional period, the UK is still seen as part of the EEA. So we're looking at the GDPR breach obligations until the end of this year, when the new UK GDPR comes in. When do you actually need to take action when there's a breach? If you're a processor and if you're a controller, what's the obligation in terms of when does the clock start ticking and what is that clock?
Okay, so the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, actually mandates this out in the articles. It explains that data processors have a duty to notify a data controller as soon as they become aware of a breach. Now, depending on your culture, depending on what country you're in, depending on what's acceptable, and depending on your own individual interpretation, what as soon as you become aware of a breach might mean one thing to me, and it might mean a completely different thing to somebody else like you, Robert. So for example, for you, that might mean, oh, I've become aware of it. I have to let my controller know within the next 60 minutes or within the next 10 minutes. For me, it might be, or for somebody else, it might be, okay, I've become aware of this. Let me think about what's happened, and maybe in 2 weeks' time when I come back from holiday, I'll pick up the phone and I'll let them know. I'll drop them an email. But right now, I need to go and pack my suitcase, so I'm aware of it. I'll let you know. So what I would recommend to all data controllers and all data processors is when you're reviewing your contracts, or when you're putting those contracts together, specify what that means. And usually, I would say, in any case, within 24 hours. So as a data controller, you know that within 24 hours of your data processor becoming aware of that breach, you've been informed, and then you can start taking the next steps or mitigating against those things. Now, the issue here is, even though you've been notified within 24 hours of the processor becoming aware, the breach might have happened, or might have started a week ago, a month ago, even a year ago. But it's only as soon as they become aware. So it's very important for all controllers to be able to know about those incidents as soon as they can.
Absolutely, because there's classic examples that criminals will get into your system at one point. You won't necessarily know for some time, and then you become aware, and then you can contain it. Absolutely. And so how do you think Blackbaud has done? And could you explain the timing? Because this breach happened back in May 2020, so a few months ago, and we're still getting notifications coming out from higher education and Labour Party, etc., hitting the news now. So could you just talk us through that timing and how you think Blackbaud did, and the sort of what they've said around that?
Yeah, so I mean, look, the first thing we need to understand is Blackbaud is a massive corporation. And when you have the corporation of the size and the scale of Blackbaud, they are always going to be susceptible to attacks. And in fact, they make a very attractive target. And I think in one of the statements, they mentioned that they face millions of attacks every month. So it's no surprise that one of those attacks have actually led to some of this damage being done. So how have Blackbaud actually performed? Now, the first thing to understand is Blackbaud are actually based out in the US. So the culture there and the laws there are slightly different to what we would expect within the EEA, for example. Now, the first thing Blackbaud did is they've paid that ransom. And for me, I believe that when they paid that ransom, they actually decided to decide the means and the purposes of the processing of those data sets. And therefore, it could be argued that they've then become a controller of that data. But what they did not do is inform organizations whose data that they were processing in a timely fashion. They waited a couple of weeks before they passed that information on. And that will really make a lot of data controllers and a lot of individuals feel a little bit uncomfortable. Why did it take so long for you to inform us about that? The damage could have already been done in the case of individuals. And for data controllers, that trust element might now start being questioned. And I think one of the universities, King's College London, has already terminated the contract with them.
Yeah, I did see on Blackbaud's announcement that they said that a large part of it as well was they were liaising with the law enforcement. So again, to be clear, I think Blackbaud, they've obviously, as you say, they suffer lots of breaches. They've mentioned millions of attacks. Rather, a lot of attacks, not breaches. They suffer a lot of attacks, which they successfully fend off, and they've obviously got a large security apparatus in place compared to most companies. And they managed to prevent the ransomware taking hold, and then they paid so it didn't encrypt everything. It just but they did manage to take a certain subset of data, and that the payment was to get the criminal to agree that they deleted that data and only paid it afterwards. I totally agree. One shouldn't pay in these situations, but I think possibly Blackbaud might say that discussion with law enforcement agencies was part of it. And the GDPR allows for postponed notification if you're working with law enforcement agencies, does it? I think it does, doesn't it?
I think it needs to be assessed on a case-by-case situation, depending on the risks and the fact that so working with a law enforcement agency could just be the fact that you reported something, and therefore it might not justify the delayed notification. So it needs to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Is there an ongoing investigation? What is the size and scale of the likelihood of harm? and what are the benefits of delayed notification, and what other regulations and laws do you need to follow. So, for example, if it's something that happened in one of the heavily regulated financial services industries, you might not be able to actually pass that information on because it might still be an ongoing investigation, and therefore you might be tipping off the perpetrator. So therefore you wouldn't be able to, because you'd have it under legal obligation. So it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely, yes. And it was a long period of delay here, which is a very interesting one. It's interesting to hear people are moving. So in terms of what people can do to prepare for this, looking at the security side of things, how do you actually prepare against a ransomware if you're not a company the size of Blackbaud? Are there sort of simple steps people can take to ward off a ransomware attack?
There are simple steps. There are very simple steps people can take to mitigate against the risks of being a victim of a malware attack. And the first one I would say starts off with training your people. We all know human error is one of the major causes of data breaches and data attacks.
Yeah.
So the first thing is to train people in how to recognize what might be a suspicious link and enable them to have good hygiene. And training is not just sitting on a computer for 20 minutes, skipping through a couple of slides and then doing a test at the end that your friends have given you the answer to. It's actually engaging with your employees, engaging with your person, making sure they get it, but the ongoing awareness to make sure that culture is there and that awareness is always there. And sometimes you might do simulations and you might do run-throughs and you might just test them every now and then, just to make sure that they understand what to look out for in an email. Why should they click this link? And also, you can have good hygiene from your IT policies and standards, only using trusted sources of apps, only using trusted software. But the most important thing here is when a ransomware or a malware attack happens, it starts locking you out of your data. So if for example, I have a 5 notebooks that keep all my notes in, and then somebody takes that bag with my notebooks, that's got all of my information. There's nothing I can do. However, if every night when I come home, I scan those notebooks and I have a backup copy, which is separate to that bag where I keep all of my notes, even if they take that bag, the risk of me not being able to do anything and the risk of me being paralyzed is minimized because I know I've got a scanned backup copy that I can continue to work from as of last night. So the second problem becomes, okay, now the fact they've got this notebook, they've got all of the information in there. And that's where we can talk about encryption and other forms of encryption and how do we protect that. And that's a conversation for data protection or cybersecurity experts rather than the privacy of it. So we're concerned with the privacy of that data and how do we keep that private. And so, for example, a couple of things I could do to keep that private is when I put my notebooks in those places, I could have separate notes in separate books that don't always correspond with everything. So anyone that picks up those notes, it's pretty useless to them. They don't understand what I'm talking about. I've put in codes, I've put in different places, and they would need to understand everything to be able to do that, and they probably won't have the time to mess about with that.
I love that example of the notebooks. It really brings home the idea of keeping backups and having backups in different places and having network segmentation. So if somebody gets into one part of your network, they're not necessarily going to be able to get into other parts. The national, the NCSC has a fantastic set of materials on this and great advice on ransomware, covering a lot of the areas that you're talking about there as well, and two-factor authentication, things like that. So how do you think
two-factor authentication is? Yeah, I was going to say two-factor authentication is a massive way, organizations, and a very simple way to make sure that even if somebody was able to get into your systems, what they can do with that is limited because they won't be able to pass that two steps of the two-factor authentication. And by two-factor authentication, to anyone that might be new to this, it basically means you have one password and one way of entering. So let's just say I want to get into my emails, I want to get into my Google emails. I'll go in there, I'll put in my username, and then I'll put in my password. Then I might get a notification on my phone asking me, is this really you? Are you really trying to get into your emails, or is it somebody else? And unless that person has a clone of my mobile device as well, and they have all of that information, it's going to be very difficult for them to get into that. Even though they might have the password from my email, they still won't be able to access that information. So two-factor authentication is a very simple, but a very strong and robust way of defending against malware.
Absolutely. There's lots of free apps out there as well, aren't there, that people can use? Google Authenticator, Alfie, all these sort of apps are out there. It's a fantastic thing to use, two-factor authentication. So that's we've looked at the security aspects, and obviously we're Privacy Kitchen, so we're focused on the privacy part, but security is one of the 7 principles in GDPR, but from a privacy point of view, when you're looking at, as an organization, preparing for a breach and putting in place the right sort of procedures and teams and what have you, what's the sort of process there that an organization would look at and say, right, let's get ready. We don't really have an incident response team or an incident response plan. What are the sort of 5 steps people need to do to put something in place to make sure that they can respond well when something like this happens?
So I've been putting in place an incident response plan, or responding to a data breach is a bit like responding to a fire. Since we've been in school, we've had fire drills. So in the case of, unfortunate event of a fire, everyone knows exactly what they do, and you can almost do it with your eyes closed because you've done it so many times. And similarly, when it comes to data privacy and data security and incidents, we should have the same kind of drills in place. So the first thing we need to do is to appoint individuals as part of your breach response unit or incident response unit. So in that incident response unit should be key stakeholders for different areas of the business that would be beneficial and that would be helpful to mitigate and plan against any of those risks. And each of those individuals should have certain responsibilities and should have different areas which they focus on. So the first thing I would do is identify who should be part of my incident response unit. The next thing I would do is then make a plan. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to identify what's happened. So how are we going to do that? Who's going to be responsible for that? Once we've identified what happened, then we need to investigate what is the likelihood and the risk and what could potentially happen, and how can we mitigate against those. Once we've understood those things, one of the other things we need to identify within 72 hours is, do we need to notify the supervisory authority? Now, sometimes it might be that we don't have enough information to make that decision, so it might just be worth telling them there's been an incident, we have this information and more information is to follow, and we are doing X, Y, and Z, or we're taking X, Y, and Z steps to take steps to mitigate against any further damage or any further likelihood of harm. And these are the steps that we're taking. And in most cases, the supervisory authorities will be actually quite accepting of that. And in some cases, they might actually even offer you support and be part of your incident response unit, depending on the size of your organization. Once you've taken all those steps, the next step you need to identify is, do we need to identify what kind of data is here? So you want to understand the categories of data. And if it's sensitive or special category data, then the next thing you want to do is think about, do you need to inform the data subjects whose data might be involved in such an incident? And then once you've done all of those things, the next thing you want to do is, okay, what happened? What went wrong? And how can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And actually, what did we do right? And how do we make sure we do more of that and we do it quicker and more efficiently going forward, or the next time an incident happens?
Fantastic. That's a really good overview of the preparation steps one can put in and how you react, and then the learnings from it, which is so key. In terms of that risk assessment, so when there's a breach under GDPR, you have to notify. The default position is to notify the authorities unless there's unlikely to be a risk to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects, and then to notify the data subjects if there's a likely high risk. So there's been a lot of argument and discussion around, are people over notifying to the authorities or under notifying to the authorities? But what sort of factors do you take into account in that risk assessment? What sort of damages are you looking at? Because sometimes it can be a lot broader than people might otherwise expect.
So what I would look at, I'll put myself in the situation of the data subject and also the criminal, and think, if I had this information, what is the most damage I could do with this? What is it likely to reveal about me? And how might it then be used to cause more damage? So that's what is the likelihood of the risk. Then you need to look at what is the impact of the risk as well. So one is, what is the likelihood? How likely is it that this data breach or this incident is going to cause damage? And how likely is it that that might actually happen? And that's the metric that you kind of want to use to identify whether it is something that is likely to cause harm, and the likelihood of that happening is quite high as well.
And so that harm, it's not just about the loss of control of your personal data. As you say, the damage that people can cause, I think one of the things with the notifications here, people might say, well, if the subset of data that was taken in this breach was all quite low level and there was no finance information and this sort of thing, why is everyone doing all this notification? And as you say, I think if you look at the sort of questions of identity theft, people ask you very standard questions. What's your birth date? What's your mother's maiden name? Where did you go to university, perhaps? These sort of questions. And so all this biographical, any sort of biographical data can really help someone carry out some identity fraud. And then, as you say, that can be finance and what have you.
That's right, and I mean, there's an increase in different types of people trying to get information from you. So now that they know certain pieces of information about you, they might know your name, they might know your date of birth, they might know where you went to university. They could use that information to call you and pretend they're calling from your university and saying, "Hey, we're reaching out from King's College London. We noticed that you're doing really well recently, right, and we just want you to come and talk to some of our students. So we just wanted to know if you'd be willing to support us. We only need about £30 to do the next fundraiser because of whatever situation." And you might think, "Oh, King's College London, I really had a really good time there. I was part of the societies and they're actually calling me. £30, yeah, why not? Here's my credit card details," and that's it. The rest is, only on pure imagination what might happen from that.
Fitting in with fundraising, I mean, we talked about phishing. You mentioned phishing emails earlier, and this is really targeted phishing of, calling up. People are doing it with COVID. I mean, the phishing emails related to COVID have spiked, or spiked during the COVID lockdown using the COVID information. So that's a great example of a criminal using some what looks like quite innocuous information and being able to just, in a way that most people wouldn't think of, just calling up, say, "Hi, we've suffered this breach. We're doing a new information security project. We're looking to fundraise. Can you give us 30 bucks," and this sort of stuff.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's one of the dangers of these criminals. They've got all day to sit there and think of how much damage they can do with as little as possible. But at the same time, one of the other reasons why there might be notification is because some of these organizations reveal information about us. So, for example, the Labour Party. Anyone that's made a donation to the Labour Party, that somebody now understands who they're politically affiliated to, and under the GDPR, that is special category data. That's information that could be used to discriminate against somebody, and therefore it needs to be notified.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one interesting bit about we're talking about special categories like health, political affiliation, trade union membership, sexual orientation, this sort of thing. Financial data is not in there, and this is quite an interesting one. So in the US, you might be a university in the UK and you've got US students. You might be looking at, well, do we need to notify under US law as well? And under US law, there's a very different breach notification regime out there, isn't there?
There is. With US law, the notification regime and the requirements change from state to state. So in one state, it might be that you have to report it even if it doesn't include financial information. And in another state, the laws will be completely different. But what we do know is the CCPA, the California Consumer Data Act, came into force recently. And that is the most robust set of US state laws. And that is probably what I would look to if I was in one of the US states, to kind of understand my responsibilities, not just under the legal obligation, but also morally and ethically as well.
Yeah, and there's a good few £100 fine for each incident. And one of the things in the CCPA as well is, as you mentioned earlier, if the data was encrypted, it reduces your risk massively. I think encryption is a big key from this in terms of the preparation steps people can take. As I love that notebook example. So making sure you have copies elsewhere so that the availability of the information isn't affected, making sure that you've encrypted all of those notebooks and tried to restrict the access so that the confidentiality isn't affected either. And obviously this is all about appropriate as well, appropriate measures. And could you talk a little bit about how one organization might be affected more by the release of the same type of information than another organization based on the nature of the data subjects and what they do?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, a really good example to focus on here might be the British and Foreign Bible Society. So that's a charity that suffered a data breach in the last couple of years, and it was actually fined £100,000 by the ICO. And what happened is someone had actually targeted that organization and taken the information of their database, so they've taken names and email addresses and potentially phone numbers. Now, Because it was the British Bible of society, what that meant was those details revealed some kind of special category information about somebody. So we know people that the data that came from this organization, it means that these people are more likely to be of the Christian faith. They're clearly interested in the Bible, and therefore we can use that information, or one can use that information to discriminate against them. And one's faith might be quite personal to someone, they might not want other people to know. Now, for example, let's take that same information and let's say we have a library where they've lost the same information. So they lost names, they've lost email addresses, they lost phone numbers. And in the context of a library, that data might not be so important because it's just names and email addresses and there isn't really much they can do about that. But on the other hand, when we have the British Bible Society, even though it's the same kind of data, this actually reveals more information about them just by the type of organization it happens to be. And that's really the difference between one organization and another and context.
That's a great example of looking at the context of the breach as to the notification. And a final question that came in is really around, so it's not just GDPR. I mean, we're both very practical practitioners, and everyone can find Kazient privacy experts online and Jamal's details online, and obviously Keepable's there as well. But we're both very practical, and we understand that GDPR exists in the broader enterprise risk regime. And so there would be other reasons as well why people might be making those notifications. It might be they have decided under GDPR it's sufficiently low level they don't need to, but there might be an ethical or a moral or another regulatory aspect of making that. So could you sort of talk about that maybe in the context of a university or the National Trust, for example, how their decision processing might be in terms of, do we notify people, what do we tell them, as well as looking at the GDPR obligations, but other obligations?
Yeah, so I mean, look, the first thing is we need to understand and look at what our legal obligations are. And for that, we can look at regulations such as the General Data Protection Regulation or the Data Protection Act or any other regulation that we might be, depending on the industry that we're in. So for example, if you're in financial services, there might be a duty to notify regardless. If you're in a creative arts industry, there might not be any regulations in that and there might be no duty. However, one of the things we understand is organizations do well when they cultivate trust. And in order to cultivate trust, it's sometimes important to be open and transparent. And what a lot of organizations will do is that we feel really strongly about what's happened here. And we think we want to be transparent because we've always been transparent. We have a good relationship with our stakeholders and we want to continue to maintain that relationship. So therefore, we want to be completely transparent with them and say, look, this has happened. It's nothing to worry about. We've done a risk assessment on it and we think they've only seen your names. Even though there's nothing to worry about, we just want to be upfront. We want to tell you about it. And you know what? To make sure that something like this doesn't happen again, here's exactly what we're doing, and this is what we've done. And that suddenly turns a problem that could have potentially been a bit embarrassing into something that actually becomes a positive advertisement for your company. It shows that you're very proactive. You've told me about something even though you didn't need to, but actually you've gone and told me what you've done about it, which means that I should feel more safe and more confident. And when I compare you, your organization, to another organization, when I don't even know what's happening, who am I going to go with? The one that's I've got a relationship that I trust, that tells me when things go wrong and what they've done to fix it, or someone who I'm going to take a risk and I know nothing about it. And when you put it into those contexts from a moral and ethical point of view, and you take it from cultivating trust and inspiring confidence, that's absolutely the way to go.
That's a great answer, and it's a great answer as well around doing the right thing and doing the right thing legally and morally and ethically, but also the benefits of doing that in terms of building trust with customers, driving that business as well. I think that's a fantastic note for us to end on. So thank you so much. We've looked at who Blackbaud is, what ransomware is, the nature of this attack, what the obligations are under GDPR, how the different players in this acted on that. We looked at measures to prepare for it, both from a security and a privacy point of view, and how to react when it happens, how to look at the risk management, the risk assessment of it, and notifications and learnings, obviously. And a great note to finish on about, it's all about trust, showing that you can be trusted, displaying that and building that business on top of that trust. So thank you very much, Jamal. Thank you very much, everybody. This recording will be available on Privacy Kitchen in the usual way soon. Look out for it on LinkedIn as well. Thanks very much. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Robert, and that's great value you've delivered there, so I'm really pleased.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.